In this lesson, I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about the nature of socialism as a political ideology. And essentially, we're just going to run through some of the early socialist thinkers with specific reference to individuals like, for example, Marx and Engels, but also thinking about people such as Rosa Luxemburg. This will be the penultimate lesson on the question of socialism, but also it will be the penultimate lesson on the question of political ideologies. From there, we're going to start talking about specific issues within political philosophy more generally. So thinking about things like distributive justice, the nature of democracy, the idea of civil society, etc., etc. So we'll talk about the development of socialism in this lesson, specifically examining a number of key thinkers in the early socialist movements. And you can't really think about socialism and communism without focusing on Marx and Engels. These are the sort of the two founding fathers, if you will, of basic principled socialism. They are arguably the founding fathers of what becomes known as the socialist tradition, that sort of coercively took over the idea of socialism away from the people like Fourier, for example, the sort of utopian socialist movements, and developed a much more grounded, philosophically rigorous conceptualization of socialism. They contributed to the works of political economy and philosophy through a number of very important pieces of writing. They wrote, for example, the Communist Manifesto. They wrote Das Kapital, volumes 1 to 3. They wrote the German Ideology and also Critique of the Goethe Program. And when I say they wrote, this was often Karl Marx as funded by Friedrich Engels as well. And ultimately, we think about the nature of society in these works. We think about the concept of capitalism. We think about the idea of the economy and labor value and economic theory, as well as basic principles about society and the nature of society and the nature of revolution. In the Communist Manifesto, for example, they argue that history of society is the history of class struggle. Their philosophy is grounded very much so in a theory of history, thinking about the nature of history and the way in which it develops, and they argue fundamentally that it is the history of class struggle. This emphasizes their understanding of historical materialism, something that we focused on in the previous videos, the nature of dialectics within historical materialism. Marx was very much an individual who took a lot of inspiration from somebody who very much gave him a lot of inspiration, that being, of course, Hegel. Marx was considered to be one of the sort of young Hegelians, along with people such as Feuerbach. And Marx took some of the ideas of Hegel, some of the sort of Hegelian ideas related to things like dialectics and dialectical materialism, and examined how this could apply to the nature of history and the history of class struggle. For more on this, check out our last lesson. In addition to this, Marx and Engels also argued that the existence of the state perpetuates interests of whichever class controls the means of production. Marx and Engels were very much not statists in the sense that they believed in the existence of the state. Instead, they argued that when we see the transition into a communist society, the state and the legal system that essentially upholds it would, quote, wither away, would not be in any kind of need. The people who owned the means of production, according to Marx and Engels, were the bourgeois, and they were the people who essentially would capitalize on the labor extraction of the people who simply sold their labor for profit. Those were the proletariat. Marx and Engels also referred to the concept of religion as, quote, the opium of the people. The idea here was that, like opium, religion sedated society. It made society weak to understanding and to realizing their material and their class struggles. It was sort of a way in which they could neuter society, such that they didn't have to think about their sort of class consciousness. They didn't have to think about the alienation of their labor, and they didn't have to think about the struggles that existed as being part of a working environment, being part of the proletarian class. The reform into a communist society, therefore, would be done by a number of means. Firstly, according to Marx and Engels, Marx, of course, was very much a revolutionary socialist. There would be a worker revolution. The workers would take back the means of production. They would take control of the means of production from the bourgeois. A transitionary period would then exist, which was known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Remember here, when we think about the word dictatorship, it doesn't have the same kind of negative and pejorative connotation when Marx is writing about dictatorship as was the case when we think about dictatorships today. We're not thinking about people like Saddam Hussein or Stalin or Hitler. When we're thinking about dictatorship just meant complete control. So complete control by the proletariat, a dictatorship of the proletariat was what they were thinking of there. Moving on then, next, a transition into a classless society would start to take place. After this transitionary period, after this sort of dictatorship of the proletariat, you see the development of a classless society, where, according to Marx and Engels, the state would simply wither away. This really formed the basis and the foundation of basic Marxist theory, basic socialist communist theory that would then be developed and essentially thought about in various different ways by a number of different individuals after Marx and Engels. So people like, for example, Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg was born in 1871 at the point of German reunification and died in 1919. And she was a Polish-born Marxist who had contributed to a number of works that form part of the socialist tradition. So, for example, works such as Reform and Revolution, or The Mass Strike, or The Political Party and Trade Unions. All of these are, of course, very much socialist works, as you can tell by the title. Luxemburg was heavily critical of an idea of socialism that could be achieved through the use of reform. And this is one of the things that is heavily debated among socialists and sort of communist thinkers. The idea that you can sort of have revolutionary socialism versus evolutionary socialism. On the one hand, revolutionary socialism is posited by people like Rosa Luxemburg, people like Karl Marx. The idea that you need a very strong inflection point at which a revolution will take place. The workers will take the means of production, and the basic structures of society that upheld the class infrastructure and upheld the nature of the state would have to be torn down in this transitionary period. Evolutionary socialists believe that there could be the idea of socialism through reform, the idea that you can work within the system and you can maybe pass laws, you can maybe implement new policies that will eventually lead us closer to a socialist state. According to people like Luxemburg and Marx, this idea of socialism through reform, this idea of evolutionary socialism, is impossible. It's impossible to achieve because the basic structures that you would require to essentially implement these reforms are the basic structures that need to be torn down in order to allow for there to be the ownership of the means of production by the working class, by the proletariat. She said that a mass strike and a worker revolution were the only ways in which we could achieve worker emancipation. She said that mass strike provides a number of very important and key utilities. They bring about the proletariat. They bring together the proletariat in recognition of their class consciousness. They become aware of their struggle, of their alienation from their labor as the result of the ownership of the means of production and the extraction of their labor for profit by the bourgeois. They can also educate workers so as to better develop and to organize their worker movements to make their mass strikes and worker revolutions more effective and more likely to succeed and achieve the kind of socialist revolution that is necessary. She argues that the basic reform would not be able to achieve socialism, that what is required, therefore, is socialism through revolution rather than socialism through evolution. And this is really where we're going to go on to now, the idea of revolutionary versus evolutionary socialism. And as I've mentioned already, the sort of original Marxist conceptualization of socialism is revolutionary. And some of the more popular conceptions of socialism, so for example, Marxist-Leninism, the kind of ideas of socialism as elucidated by Rosa Luxemburg, are also revolutionary in nature. They argued, for example, Marx and Engels specifically, that socialism can only and will only ever be achieved through revolutionary means. This would be a worker bottom-up revolution, and this revolution will come as the result of worker alienation and the idea of growing class consciousness. For those of you who haven't watched the previous videos, alienation is essentially the concept that when a worker essentially makes money, they make money by being able to sell their labor for profit. And the people who own the means of production will essentially take some of that labor value and they will enrich themselves, and they will utilize the sort of the fruits of their labor, the products that they create or whatever, and they will sell those products for profit. And what this does is create a sense of alienation, a sense of distinction, a sense of separation between the worker and the labor, the result of their labor that they essentially have had to put into working in order to create some kind of living. And the idea here is that this idea of value that is enshrined in labor is extracted for profit by the bourgeois class, who don't have to do anything with their labor in order to achieve any kind of profit or any kind of income. Once a revolution has taken place, according to the revolutionary socialists, the workers will seize the means of production and enter into this transitionary period. They replace liberal democracy with a dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat is something that could only be achieved, according to Rosa Luxemburg, through the reduction of and the eventual elimination of the state. By contrast, then, of course, you have the evolutionary socialists, people such as Beatrice Webb, for example, who sort of proposed a much more liberal version of socialism, if that is not too contradictory a set of concepts. This is the idea of the inevitability of gradualism. And this was essentially the idea that political democracy will eventually lead us into a transition into a state of socialism. That as political democracy continues and as people become more and more consciously aware of their position within the state, they will use their voice using political democracy and gradually lead to a situation in which we transition into a state of socialism. It is the position, therefore, that socialism can be achieved using legislative and maybe even parliamentary reform. Of course, the reason why a lot of the revolutionary socialists reject this out of hand is because they argue that it is the same institutions such as parliaments and legislatures and governments that uphold the kind of class structures that keep socialism from being able to be achieved. And so it is impossible. It is counterproductive. It is almost a contradiction to suggest that you can achieve socialism through these very same institutions. A key example that is often illustrated by people like Beatrice Webb is that socialism can be achieved through a various number of different policy prescriptions. One such example of how this can be achieved is through the idea of universal suffrage. The idea of allowing everyone to vote will allow the voices of the working classes to be heard, and the voices of the working class will inevitably lead to a situation in which socialism is much more easily preferred, given that the working class is a much larger group. Through education and gradual legislative reform, therefore, socialism is able to be achieved within the basic context of the state as it exists currently. The final lesson on the issue of socialism will talk a little bit about the nature of social democracy, which is sort of a liberalization of basic principles of socialist ideas. Most people argue that it isn't even socialism if in that regard. And then, like I said, we will spend more time focusing in a lot of detail on various different elements of political philosophy. Now, if you feel like these videos on political ideology haven't gone into the kind of depth and detail that you would like, that's because essentially I'm not really aiming to teach political ideologies in any great detail in this series. This is a series on political philosophy, and really I just wanted to give you a basic background to some of the major theories, so conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, just so you have a basic overview of where each of these positions are. But for the most part, I want to spend the majority of the time focusing on all of the special topics within political philosophy. So the nature of civil society, the idea of democracy, the idea of the nature of the state, the idea of redistributive justice and justice more generally. So that's what we're going to be doing after the next video in a great amount of detail.